Okay, so when we're talking about analog multitracks, we're generally talking about tape width, and that sometimes usually leads to track count. So the three most popular formats are quarter-inch tape, and you'll see that usually in 2-track decks, but occasionally you'll see 4 tracks. That happens to be a picture of a mono track, so that's a really old, and you can tell because there's only one VU meter here. So that's how you can know that that's just a mono track. Generally, quarter-inch tape is 2 tracks, and then on the prosumer or consumer level, it'll generally be 4-track machine. Then you get half-inch tape. So now our tape width becomes twice as thick, and you'll see, and there's a lot of different versions there. I've even seen half-inch 24 tracks. Not that popular, but generally you're looking at 4 or 8, and then occasionally there's mixed down decks. So here is a half-inch 2-track. That would sound amazing. Lots of tape width for then just the audio to be on there. So you can tell the fidelity goes down when you start adding more tracks. Now this happens to be the model that we have here in the studio, which is the half-inch 16 track. So now you're trying to squeeze 16 tracks in the space of a half-inch of tape. And the final popular format that you'll see is 2-inch tape. So generally that will be 24 tracks. And again, looking at meter bridges, you can see that this is a 24-track machine. 2-inch 8-track does exist, and 2-inch 16-track is pretty coveted. That's pretty awesome at running at your full tape speed. That's a lot of fidelity. But generally 2-inch 24 tracks are what you'll see. Grab this picture. This is actually cleaning machines, but just the quarter-inch machine next to the 2-inch machine, you can see that side by side how big the tape reels are. A 2-inch tape reel probably weighs about 30 pounds too. That's the other way that you can tell is it weighs a lot. So when we're looking at track count, you can see here's what it looks like. So we've got our playback head or record head, and what we're looking at cassette tape, if you're familiar with that. We're squeezing 4 tracks into 1/8-inch tape. And you can see full track. That'd be mono, quarter-inch, stereo, quarter-inch, what our tape widths. So you see 24 track, 2-inch is pretty awesome size-wise, and then you can see that 8-track, 1-inch. You can also, if you look through here, if you ever see the playback head, if not counting meter bridges, but you can also see based on the slots where how many heads how many tracks that particular head can record. So close up of a 4-track head assembly, you can see we've got 1, 2, 3, 4 spaces across the tape. And we're zoomed in, so it's hard to tell the tape width based on this. But just looking at the head, you can see the different levels that tell you that can do 4 tracks. So looking at our tape here, a couple things I want to make a mention. So we've got our supply reel, which is over to the left. So the analog tape is going to flow in this direction, and it's going to have our take-up reel. We will always put the take-up reel on first and rewind the tape. We'll throw it tails out. That's another slide, so I'll talk about that. Interestingly, the motors are going in opposite directions. So the supply wheel and the take-up reel are actually motoring in opposite directions, and that keeps the tape tension solid. And depending on what you're doing, then the motor is given emphasis. If you're trying to play, this motor is going a little bit more powerful than the supply reel, but the supply reel is actually working in the opposite direction, just at a slower amount. We have our 3 heads here. So we have our erase head. That's going to be our first head. So when we go to record, it will erase that tape. If we try to make everything will be done earlier. And then you can see there's a gap. And then we hit the record head. So based on that, you can see that that's where we do our recording. But the record head also plays back. It's pretty important to understand that this records and plays. Once you're done multi-tracking, you can move over to the play head. So that only does playback, does no recording. So our erase head magnetizes the particles, record, analog signal is transduced, and then playback. The record head's obviously the most important head. So once we're done recording, you just use the playback. And what is not shown on this picture is what will happen is these little capstans here will move the tape a little bit, so that it's not going over the record head if we're not using the record head. And it will make it so that if we're using the record head and not the playback head, it won't go over the playback head. So just like constantly rubbing that's how our heads get worn down. So it's important to use to make mechanically, the head we're not using tape's not going across it. So our monitoring modes, how do we hear what's going on? So obviously with playback, we're going to hear through our playback head. We're going to hear input, which would be pre-multitrack. We talked about that. We don't do that a lot. We always monitor post-out multitrack. Repro, that's going to be after we record the signal, and then sync. So in input mode, all we're going to hear is the input signal. So you can hit play, you'll be hearing the input mode. I'm sorry, you can hit record, you'll hear the input mode. But when you go to hit playback, you won't hear anything because all you're hearing is the input mode. In sync mode, we're going to be on the record head. So all the playback and recording will be done on that same head. And the idea, it's called sync because when I'm playing along with the tracks that are already pre-recorded, everything will be synced at the same time. Because of that gap between the record head and the playback head, if I was playing back on one head and recording along with that, the timing would be off. So the sync head is that record head. That means that when the snare drum hits and I play a bass note on top of that, when you go to move it to the playback head, they'll be both there at the same time. And then repro mode only uses the playback head. So again, that's just playback signal. And basically then the record head backs up a little bit. The tape is not rubbing against it. And we're saving the life of a record head because you obviously during recording and overdubbing, that head is used a lot. So here's a picture of this is the record head and this is the playback head. And again, if we were playing back our drums and trying to play bass and we were recording the bass, you could see this physical gap then would prevent the track from all being played on the playback head. This track would have to be played on the record head because of this physical gap. So what we do is we use the sync head and we are actually playing back the tracks that we're listening to, and we just engage the recording on that particular track. That way when we move it all to the playback head, they'll all be aligned together. So that's what we're looking at when sync mode, really important. Our tape speed. So we have inches per second is how this is measured for us. So 15 inches per second takes about 30 minutes of recording time. Then 30 inches per second takes 15 minutes. So you can see the converse relationship there. So depending on your budget, you might be deciding whether you go high speed or low speed. Consumer 2 tracks, you can go see a little slower, and then you can see how slow cassette runs. What's interesting is that frequency response on the analog machines does change with your tape speed. So at the blue is our 15 inches per second, and you can see the big bump in the low end here, where the significant drop off in the red, which is our 30 inches per second. Our 30 inches per second, you can see all the way goes up to 20K though. So this is your trade-off. Do you want less low end, or do you want that really, really high 20K? Now that's all overtones and harmonics, no fundamentals up there, but it's obviously going to change the recording. So if you think about 70s recordings and 60s recordings, there's definitely a lush warmth there, and they're not that brittle high end, and you can kind of see exactly why. So if you're recording at 15 inches per second to use the most amount of recording tape, you've got this nice big bump low end, and then this real natural rolled off high end. So real interesting there.